He kicked the bucket of soapy water so hard it exploded across the marble, but it was her heel that struck skin. Madame Yvonne Adou's stiletto catching the new maid on the hip as the tray clattered and silence swallowed the mansion. Then, with a voice like broken glass, Yvonne hissed, "Out of my house, you gutter girl, before I teach you what real power feels like." If you're watching this right now, please smash the subscribe button and turn on notifications. Your support keeps these African tales alive and helps more people find them. Kendi didn't fall. She held herself upright the way palm trees hold their breath in Harmattan wind, both hands shaking as silverware skittered to a stop at her feet, the scent of lemon polish and rage rising together. Around them, staff stared with the terror of people who know a house can bite. Mensa, the gate guard, half turned, Auntie Benta, the cook, pressing a hand to her apron, the junior cleaner frozen mid-wipe near a gold console table that cost more than a year's wages. "Madame, I only asked for water," Kendi said softly, accents salted by far coast villages, eyes burning but dry. On her ankle, hidden under rolled hem, a small ring of sky-blue beads pressed into skin, a memory she never could name. Yvonne snapped her fingers without looking, the gesture of a queen dismissing thunder. "Dock her pay and mop this mess. And tell procurement I don't want village hands near Crystal again," she said, shrugging a silk blazer from her shoulders as though it were a clog she'd decided the day didn't need. She crossed to the window where Rivergate City glittered like a promise it never intended to keep. In the glass, her reflection hovered beside the framed photo she never moved, Kojo's laughing eyes and a toddler in yellow beads on his shoulders, a ghost she had trained herself not to see. "Please, madame," Kendi tried again, because hunger teaches bravery poor textbooks can't. "I worked all night, just a cup." Yvonne pivoted, lip curling. "This is not a charity kitchen. You come from mud, you bring mud. I have investors arriving. I won't have you tracking your river into my floors." The words landed with the humiliating precision of a slap, and yet Kendi's reply rose clear, a thin drumbeat no storm could drown. "Power without mercy returns empty, madame. Even the sea that swallows gives back bones." The air tightened. Auntie Benta whispered, "Child, swallow your words, this house eats back." But it was too late. Something old and wounded flashed across Yvonne's face, gone in a blink, replaced by the iron mask Rivergate's tabloids adored. "Get out." Each word a gate slamming. Kendi bent, gathering spoons with the careful grace of someone who has learned to pick up what breaks her. Her fingers were raw from bleach, her stomach an angry fist, but inside her, a stubborn flame refused to sleep. She'd washed plates in a chop bar for 2 months, saved coins in a wrapper tied under her skirt, walked across the city because bus fare was a luxury, and now, with a roof finally over her head, she could not, would not let a storm and a silk blouse blow her back into the street. She rose slowly, and as she did, the cuff of her trouser lifted. Mensa saw it first, the anklet, sky-blue beads, one slightly nicked like a crescent bite. He blinked hard, looked at the old photo on the console, then at Yvonne, then down again, confusion wrinkling his brow. He opened his mouth, then closed it, because some puzzles are dangerous when solved too loudly. Outside, jacaranda blossoms fell purple and soft across the drive, a confetti nature throws for tragedies and weddings alike. Generators hummed, staff radios crackled, somewhere a kettle clicked off, and every sound felt suddenly like a countdown. Yvonne waved toward the corridor. "Binta, replate the canapes. Mensa, the convoy arrives in 20. And you," her eyes stabbed Kendi, "if I see you again before midnight, I will show you the gate myself." Kendi's lips parted, then pressed shut. She knelt, swept the shimmering puddle into a rag, and when she stood, she did not speak again. But as she turned toward the back passage and the low heat of the kitchen, she began to hum, unthinking, quiet, the lullaby Abena had sung in a hut by the sea, the one that sounds like tidewater kissing mangrove roots. On the landing, Yvonne froze mid-step, the melody slicing through a decade she had boarded over. Memory flared, Kojo's laughter, a toddler clapping, yellow beads jingling like tiny suns, a ghost she had trained herself not to see. Then the phone rang, and she obeyed it, because in Rivergate, Phones outrank heartbeats. Downstairs the hum went on, small but steady, curling into the house's bones like a promise the walls themselves might one day remember.
10 years before the marble floors and clipped orders, Rivergate City was a fever of heat and horns. The old creek bridge trembling under trucks and danfos while street vendors lifted prayers into exhaust. Kojo Adu had pulled their SUV to the shoulder for a stubborn puncture, flashing Yvonne a grin as the tire iron caught sun, and Yvonne, impatient and unarmored in the small ways she still allowed herself, had stepped across cracked tarmac to the roadside braider, calling through the half-open window to their daughter, "Essie, keep singing, I'll be back before your song ends." The song did end, soft as sugar, and in the hush that followed, two men drifted close with the casual courage of people who make a living pretending they belong. One tapped the glass, lips smiling without warmth. "Auntie sent us," he said, voice syrupy, while the other surveyed the lanes, deciding on disaster. Essie shook her head and cradled the rag doll she'd christened Palm, so they circled once, twice, then slipped a metal pick between weather strip and lock, and by the time Kojo tightened the last lug, the sky had tilted and the car seat was empty, buckles winking like teeth. The police wrote reports, the kidnappers called with voices made grainy by old radios. Money crossed hands and vanished, and still no small footsteps returned down the hall. Gossip rose where hope thinned. Some said wealth had angered the river. Some said Yvonne had sneered at a market woman and was tasting the ancestors' salt. Some said nothing, because grief is a storm you whisper through. Weeks later, when Kojo's sedan pinwheeled off a rain-slick curve and dove into black water, Yvonne learned that grief can be plural. A body on a metal gurney, a child's empty room, a city's bright mouth chewing your name to husks. She taught her face to harden, her voice to file to an edge, and the house learned to echo orders instead of lullabies. Across the estuary at dawn, a fisherwoman named Abina followed gulls along the mangroves, feet in mud that remembered every footprint. She heard it then, thin as a reed flute, a baby's whimper where mangrove roots knuckled out of silt, and found, tucked into a faded kente shawl, a child with yellow bead-bright hair ties and eyes wide like low tide. Abina's hands were calloused nets that knew how to lift without breaking, and she said, "Hush, little moon," because the face before her felt like night softening. She named the girl Kendi, the found, tied a simple anklet of sky-blue beads to ward off forgetting, and took her home to a hut that smelled of smoke, fish, and the stubborn sweetness of boiled plantain. Life there made a different kind of wealth. Counting by shells, learning the alphabet from charcoal on a wall, naps in a raffia mat's shade while rain wrote its own stories on the roof. Kendi grew with the logic of tide, working when it came, waiting when it left. She balanced basins before she could braid her own hair, learned to bargain gently but firmly, and knew the names of winds like cousins. Abina taught her the lullaby that sounded like oars kissing water, and the rule that did not bend. When the city forgets you, the sea remembers. The cough arrived one rainy season like a debt collector and refused to leave. Herbs simmered, coins clinked in an old tin, neighbors came with prayers and thin porridge, but the fever was a fever, and Abina's strength burned down to embers, until one night she pressed Kendi's palm to her cheek and said, "Light travels, yours will too. Be kind even when hunger votes against it." And before dawn, Kendi learned that earth is heavier when it hides someone you love. She buried Abina with borrowed shovels and untrained hymns, kept the blue bead anklet and the ragged lullaby, and the box of neat receipts that proved honest work on small catches, then faced the water and said her thanks and her promise, to find a place where her hands could mean more than survival. The city was a rumor made of glass and grit. Kendi rode a lorry whose benches complained the whole way, arrived with a pocket of coins and a tray that had belonged to Abina, and made a map from kindnesses.
one chop bar auntie who let her wash plates in exchange for leftover stew, one tailor who mended her skirt for the price of a story, one conductor who shouted, "Small girl, hold tight," and meant it. She slept sometimes under a zinc veranda that drummed when it rained, sometimes on a church pew that remembered everyone's sorrow equally. And each morning she hunted the notice boards for work that didn't require certificates she didn't have or family she couldn't claim. When she saw the Adu estate posting, live-in domestic needed, room provided, competitive pay, she felt the familiar tides pull, ignored a gate guard's warning that some houses eat back, and stepped through gates tall enough to scare clouds. Rules came like hail: wake at 4, floors by 6, breakfast by 7, eyes down, mouth quiet. And she told herself that obedience could be a bridge to dignity. But bridges remember what crosses them, and somewhere between the bleach burns and the smell of citrus polish, the old lullaby slipped out of her without permission, rising up a staircase toward a woman who had taught herself not to hear, and scene by scene, like photographs left too long in sun, the past began to reappear.
The Adu estate taught Kendi its language in 3 weeks. The timing of the sprinklers that woke at 4:10 a.m., the way the south corridor held on to last night's perfume, the precise click that meant Madame Yvonne's bedroom lock had turned and everyone should become quieter than dust. She moved through the mansion like a shadow with hands, sweeping jacaranda petals from the portico before dawn, polishing brass that reflected a thinner version of her face, learning that the house preferred everything invisible except its own shine. On her first Sunday, Auntie Binta slipped her a boiled yam wedge and a warning: "Eat quick, child, this house eats back." And Kendi smiled thanks, tucking the food behind the pantry door while she mopped figure eights on marble that felt like a cold lake underfoot. The staff orbited Yvonne like planets around a sun that sometimes flared without warning. Mensa, the gate guard, kept count of convoys and rumors. Fafa, the driver, swore he could tell what kind of day they would have by how hard Madame's heels bit the tile at 7:03. The junior cleaner, Adzo, practiced silence like a skill. Yvonne herself was a choreography of control: white blouses that never wrinkled, a voice that sliced meetings into obedience, eyes that refused to land on anyone too long, as if contact were a currency she wouldn't spend. Only twice did her mask flicker. Once when Kendi's humming surfaced in the stairwell, a tide song Abena had taught by firelight, and once when Kendi paused in the salon, arrested by a portrait of a toddler in yellow beads riding the shoulders of a laughing man. Yvonne materialized behind her like a cold draft. "Dust, don't stare," she said, and Kendi's spine straightened on instinct while her gaze snagged on the frame's corner where a bead of gilding had nicked, crescent-shaped, like the tiny flaw in the sky-blue bead on her own ankle. The days stacked. Dawn mopping, breakfast service, Yvonne never finished her millet porridge, laundry heat, lemon polish, late-night glassware that sang when Kendi breathed too near. When the governor's dinner loomed on the calendar like a small hurricane, the house shifted into siege. Florists arrived with arrogant lilies, a sous-chef barked about microgreens, and Yvonne's instructions multiplied. No fingerprints on crystal, no scent in the north hallway, no music audible beyond the salon threshold. Kendi learned to hold her breath through rooms, to speak with nods, to keep her hunger on a leash. She also learned the map of Yvonne's grief without being told, how the study door stayed cracked at night, how she touched the console photo only with her eyes, how her jaw found stone when the city's old gossip reappeared in a tabloid headline left open by an assistant. Billionaire philanthropist, still no closure. That afternoon, Kendi cooked jollof under Binta's supervision, coaxing sweetness from tomato paste and coaxing courage from the memory of Abena's pot. She plated it with fried chicken, sprinkled slivered onions like confetti, and carried it steady as a prayer. Yvonne took one bite,
set down the fork as if it had insulted her, and in a single motion flipped the plate. Rice and sauce burst across tile and Kendi's wrists, small comets of heat that made her hiss and bite the sound back. "Replate and learn," Yvonne said, already turning, and something inside Kendi folded to protect a flame she refused to let the wind see. Mensa watched from the doorframe, eyes moving between the mess and Kendi's ankles. The anklet flashed as she knelt to gather red-grain shame into a cloth. He glanced at the portrait again, frowned so slightly it could have been a blink, and said nothing, because some questions are gunpowder. That night, Kendi slept upright against the pantry door, palms stinging, mind drifting to the mangrove lullaby. She woke before her alarm to the ache of soap-cracked skin and the stubbornness of hope. "Child," Binta murmured at dawn, pressing Shay into Kendi's hands, "the city will not clap for you. Clap for yourself, then keep sweeping." Kendi did. She discovered the small rebellion of humming under her breath, a sound too low to scold, a line of music that stitched courage to bone. On the landing, the sound hooked Yvonne's memory like a fish. For a breath, she wasn't the woman Rivergate obeyed. She was a mother laughing as a toddler clapped yellow beads to a beat, Kojo's hand warm on her back, a Sunday with no edge. She caught herself on the banister, breath short, anger arriving to fill the crack with cement. Later, a broker came to finalize a land deal, and Yvonne's smile resumed its professional geometry. "You understand we need certainty," she told him, and certainty nodded with a pen. But when she returned to the house that evening, there was a different note in the air, as if the walls were practicing a memory. In the corridor, Kendi faltered, dizzy from bleach and skipped meals. Adzo yelped, Benta shouted for water, and Yvonne stepped into the commotion with a curse half-formed, then saw, as Kendi's hem lifted, a ring of sky-blue beads at the ankle, one bead nicked like a bitten moon. The room telescoped. Yvonne's mouth dried. Logic marched in. "These anklets sell at Makola. Beads repeat. Coincidence is a liar." She inhaled, restored her posture, and snapped, "Clinic, now. I won't have staff collapsing when guests arrive." Yet as Fafa half-carried Kendi out, and Mensa swung the gate, Yvonne's hand drifted without permission to the console photo, to the yellow beads frozen forever in gold leaf. Her fingertips hovered, retreated, then found her phone. "Reschedule the rehearsal with the band," she told her assistant, voice steady by sheer will, "and find the number for the special cases unit." Somewhere beyond the jacaranda and the generator hum, a different storm was forming, quiet, precise, and late by exactly a decade.
The Special Cases Unit smelled like burnt coffee and old paper, a narrow corridor of bulletin boards where missing faces stared back with the patience of saints. Yvonne walked it with the posture of someone who refuses to shrink. Heels counting seconds, assistant 2 steps behind, and an inspector with sleeves rolled to the elbow waiting at a metal desk that had known too many families. "Madame Adu, I'm Inspector Sefa," he said, offering a chair and a folder that felt heavier than its pages. "We've reopened several cases tied to a trafficking network we just disrupted. There are inconsistencies in your ransom logs, and a new witness says a toddler matching your daughter's description was abandoned near the estuary the same week she vanished." The words reached her like sound through water. She sat without remembering to, hands folded so tightly her rings left moons on her skin. "Alive?" she asked, the syllables small and dangerous, and Sefa's mouth shaped honesty. "We don't promise what we don't know. But this," he slid a plastic sleeve across, a photograph of an anklet, sky-blue beads in a circle, one bead with a crescent-shaped nick, was tagged in evidence. "If you see this, call us and we'll do things properly, quietly." Properly, quietly. 2 adverbs Yvonne had spent a decade forcing the city to respect. She nodded,
signed statements with a hand she refused to let tremble, and left with the folder as if it might bolt. In the car, the city performed its usual opera. Hawkers at windows with bottled water, buses wailing, a rain cloud considering the roofline, yet every sound held a new frequency, a wire strung through her ribs. Back at the mansion, she followed the noise of a small crisis to the corridor. Kendi pale on a bench, Fafa fanning her with a brochure, Auntie Binta lowering a glass to cracked lips. The hem of Kendi's trouser had ridden up. The anklet blinked like a signal fire, sky blue, one bead nicked like a big moon. For an instant, Yvonne felt the floor tilt, a sensation she had not permitted since the morgue. She regained the angle of herself with practiced violence. "Queensway Clinic, now," she said, and if her voice softened on the last word, only Binta heard it. In the sterile white of the clinic, fluorescent lights made truth look clinical. A nurse with calm hands took blood, asked routine questions, then paused at the anklet. "Pretty," she said, professional eyes flicking to the referral signed Adu. Yvonne leaned against the wall, palms damp, phone mutely bright with the governor's aide asking about seating charts and a saxophonist who only knew 3 keys. When the nurse returned, she held a printout that wasn't quite a verdict. "She's dehydrated but fine. You requested a kinship panel? Preliminary markers suggest a possible first-degree relationship. We'll need a full test to be certain." The room swayed without moving. Kendi looked from nurse to Yvonne, confusion knitting her brows, protective anger rising like a tide. "Why are you testing me?" she asked, voice rough with soap and dignity. Yvonne heard the accusation under the question and answered the one she deserved. "Because I have been lost and I am looking," she said, the honesty scraping her throat raw. Kendi's gaze cooled. "Found things don't like being handled like property." The line landed where plates and orders had never reached. Yvonne took it. She nodded once. "You're right." The nurse's pager chirped. She excused herself, leaving 2 women and a wall clock that seemed suddenly loud. Yvonne's phone buzzed again. "Inspector Seifa, if you confirm a match, do not announce. We'll move on the remaining suspects and protect the girl." Protect the girl. A decade too late, and still the only sentence that mattered. On the drive back, the city rinsed itself in a quicksilver rain. Jacaranda petals glued to the windscreen like stamps, sealing an old letter finally mailed. Kendi stared out at the blur, fingers worrying the edge of her bead anklet, breathing the way Abena had taught, slow in, slower out, while her mind worked the puzzle of this woman, the cruelty, the cracks, the sudden gentleness in the clinic that felt like a door opening into a room she didn't trust. At the gate, Mensa saluted out of habit, but his eyes searched Yvonne's face as if it contained weather reports. She gave him the smallest shake of her head, "Not yet," and the smallest lift of her chin, "Be ready." Inside, the estate was rehearsing perfection, lilies scolding the air with their scent, glassware aligned like obedient little moons, the band tuning behind the salon's drapes. Yvonne paused beneath the family portrait and let herself look, really look at the toddler with yellow beads and the man whose laughter had once made rooms kinder. "Kojo," she whispered, the name a risk and a prayer. "If there is a mercy you can reach, lay it down now." Then she called the inspector, and her voice was the voice the city obeyed. "I may have found her. Do it properly, do it quietly, and do it fast." Upstairs, Kendi sat on the edge of the staff cot, the clinic listband still creasing her skin, the lullaby at her tongue's root like a seed pushing towards light. She had not decided whether to stay past midnight, but she had decided this. If the house ate back, she would make it choke on the truth first. In the distance, thunder rearranged itself into a line of drums, and somewhere between ballroom and kitchen, between lost and found, the night began to lean towards revelation.
The text arrived like a stone dropped into a still basin. No fanfare, just a vibration in Yvonne's palm as she stood beneath the chandelier, instructing the florist to cut 2 inches off every stem. Full maternal match confirmed. And the air left her body so completely she had to grip the console table to stay upright, eye snagging on Kojo's grin in the portrait, as if he'd been waiting there to witness the sentence that would unmoor and anchor her in the same breath. Outside, the governor's convoy rehearsed authority with sirens softened for discretion. Inside, staff moved with the hush of people who knew a house could change its weather mid-afternoon. She could have hidden the message, swallowed it whole and called the inspector from the privacy of her study, but something in her had run out of hiding. She found Kendi in the service corridor lifting a crate of glassware she had no business lifting after a clinic faint, sleeves rolled past soap burn lines, the sky-blue anklet peeking like a remembered word at the hem of thrifted trousers. "Put that down," Yvonne said, the order gentled by a tremor Kendi clocked and mistrusted. The crate settled, crystal chimed, Auntie Binta reappeared with a "Madam" that held more question than title. Yvonne lifted her phone like a witness takes an oath. "The clinic confirmed what the inspector suspected," she began, voice roughened to honesty. "And her eyes flicked, despite herself to the portrait, what I prayed was not a coincidence. Kendi, I am your mother." The line did not travel clean. It struck walls hung with a decade of commands and ricocheted into 100 small histories. The plate flipped, the names thrown like stones, the way Kendi's request for water had been treated like theft, and Kendi's face set not into wonder, but into weathered caution. "My mother was Abina," she said, steady but shaking at the edges, "the fisherwoman who found me near the water and taught me to stand when the wind showed its teeth. If you are claiming me because a hospital machine says so, then say the next part clearly. Are you also claiming what you did to me before the machine pinged?" The corridor gathered more ears than eyes. Mensa, who had already suspected, Adzo, whose silence was a talent, the pastry chef with sugar under her nails, and somewhere beyond them the band practicing a polite highlife that felt obscene against the moment's rawness. Yvonne absorbed the blow the way waves take confession, nothing to argue, everything to hold. "Yes," she said, and when the floor didn't swallow her, she kept going. "I became a blade and called it survival. I broke what I could control because I could not find what I lost. That is not the same as forgiveness, and I will not ask for that now, but I will not lie about the shape of my damage." The sentence made space, not comfort, not yet, but oxygen. The phone buzzed again. "Inspector Sefa, we have 1 hour before we move. Keep her close, keep it quiet." And Yvonne translated the message into action. "The police are moving on the men who took you," she told Kendi. "They need you safe while they do. You are not property. You will choose where to stand. If it is outside my house, I will send a car. If it is near me, I will make this house answer to you." Kendi stared at the anklet as if it, not the phone, held the verdict. Abina's prayers whispered up through memory. "When the city forgets you, the sea remembers you." She thought of the lullaby that had slipped out of her mouth and lodged, uninvited, in this mansion's ribs. She thought of the mango-sweet sundaes she might have had if a tire hadn't argued with a nail on a bridge 12 years ago. "I will not be handled," she repeated softer, as if agreeing with herself. And Binta stepped between mother and daughter with the tact of a woman who had steadied more than soup pots. "Come to the kitchen," she said to both, "and sit where honesty won't echo so painfully." In the kitchen's warm light, steam curling from a pot, cloves of garlic like small moons on a board, Yvonne placed the missing person file on the table without dramatics. Photos, receipts for rewards posted, the police report with its cruel bureaucracy, Kojo's letter in his square handwriting to a future that never arrived. "I did not stop looking," she said. And Kendi's eyes, those crescenting eyes that had been staring from the portrait since she arrived, traveled the pages slowly until they snagged on a photograph of a tiny neck with a star-shaped birthmark and a toddler's grin like sunrise. "If this is true," Kendi said, fingers on the plastic sleeve like a diver's hand finds the boat's edge, "then the sea didn't just remember me. It ferried me back to the very house I swore would not break me." Mensa's cough was a polite drum roll for the future. "Madam," he ventured from the doorway, "the governor's aide says the cars are at the gate." The band switched keys. Thunder murmured rehearsal. Ivan stood, made the call to Sefa, confirmed, "We will be where you asked us to be," and then did the hardest, simplest thing she had done in 10 years. She faced the staff she had trained to fear her and said, "I have wronged you because grief taught me to be cruel. I cannot rewind the house, but I can rebuild it starting now. If you stay, it will be because you are paid properly and treated like the bones and breath of this place. If you go, your references will be gold and your back pay full." Kendi watched the words move through the room, how shoulders dipped and eyes brightened with a relief so quiet it bordered on holy. She did not forgive. Some debts are paid in seasons, not speeches. But she pulled out a chair, the one Abina would have taken, and sat. "Tell me," she said, looking at Ivan, "about the man in the picture, with the laugh." And as Ivan spoke Kojo's name aloud like a reopened window, the house adjusted its weather, and somewhere beyond lilies and glassware and convoy clocks, the city held its breath for the hour that would test whether truth could protect what it had finally returned.
The mansion breathed like a theater moments before curtain. Lilies scolding the air, chandeliers rehearsing their glitter, the band and the salons settling into a velvet high life that made even the glasses hum. And Ivan, who had built her adult self from schedules and threats, walked straight through the center of her own performance and changed the script. She tapped the bandleader's stand once, and music softened to a ribbon, then called not the governor's name, but the staff's. "Binta, Mensa, Fafa, Adso, please, all of you, come in." And the room hiccuped because the rich do not invite the hands to the stage. The governor's aide frowned. The cameras blinked awake. Donors clutched their crystal. And Kendi hovered at the threshold in a borrowed blouse Binta had pushed at her. Hospital wristband still creasing her skin, anklet bright as a whisper. "Thank you for coming into my house," Ivan said, voice with no polish left on it. "Tonight was meant for dignitaries, but the most dignified people here are the ones I have asked to stand with me." She faced the staff first, as if practicing courage, then turned to the guests. "A decade ago, this city took my child and then took my husband. I let grief make me a blade. Today, the city returned what it stole, and I will not cut with that blade again." The band's guitarist found the exact chord a confession needs. The governor cleared his throat, sensing a headline, but Ivan continued before anyone could claim the moment. "Kendi," she said, and the name trembled the room. "The clinic confirmed what the inspector suspected and what my soul knew the moment I heard your lullaby. You are my daughter." It was not a neat miracle. The word daughter did not leap from Ivan's mouth to Kendi's heart without snagging on the barbed wire of recent cruelty. Plates flung, water denied, names thrown like stones. But it did land, and when it did, the room tilted toward a truer gravity. Whispers rose, high and ugly, from a donor with a gossip page addiction. "Isn't that the Maid?" And from someone near the back, "Publicity stunt." But Auntie Benta stepped forward, planted her spoon like a staff, and hummed the shoreline lullaby that had threaded this house without permission. Mensa's baritone joined. The band slipped under the melody like a river under a bridge, and for 20 stunned seconds the salon belonged to a song older than money. Then the front gate erupted. Sirens braked to discretion, shoes on stone, and Inspector Sefa entered with 2 officers and faces that carried the news people dread and need. He moved to Ivan with a nod that understood this was her house, and also, tonight, everyone's witness. "Madame Adu," he said low, "we have warrants for the men behind the ring that took your child. One is on his way to custody. The other, the one who diverted ransoms and laundered girls through a shell foundation, is here. He tilted his chin toward a cluster of donors. A man in a dove-gray agbada froze mid-chuckle, eyes flicking for exits he had paid to be invisible. The room's temperature dropped. Yvonne didn't look at the governor or the cameras. She looked at Kendi, then at the man who had eaten a decade of her nights. "In my house?" she asked, and Sepha's knuckles flexed. "They prefer rooms where people clap," he said. Before the instinct to roar could unfurl in Yvonne's chest, Kendi stepped beside her, not touching, close enough to be chosen or to step away. "Do it properly," she said to Sepha, echoing the promise he had texted and the vow the city owed. The officers moved with the choreography of training. Warrants read, cuffs clicked, the Agbada's silk whine replaced by a thinner sound that begged money to behave like mercy. And for once, a salon that had hosted deals watched a piece of justice sign itself. Somewhere, a donor began to clap, mistaking spectacle for restoration. Yvonne raised her hand and the clapping died. "Justice is not applause," she said, then turned back to the people whose names rarely made invitations. "I have been cruel in this house. I am asking to repair with deeds, not speeches. Back pay is processed tonight. Contracts are rewritten tomorrow. A clinic and scholarship will carry Abina's name because she mothered my child when I didn't know how to breathe." The governor's wife, who had been poised to offer a quote, instead set her glass down and whispered, "Good," as if agreeing with a prayer. Kendi, who had not forgiven, but was beginning to imagine a world where forgiveness might one day move in, lifted her chin. "And rules?" she asked, voice steady. Yvonne nodded. "Rule 1, every person here is a person, not a shadow, not a hand. Rule 2, if grief tries to turn me back into a blade, you will tell me, and I will listen." A ripple of almost laughter, relief shaped like a smile, moved through the staff. The band found its way to a gentler key. The lilies smelled less like arrogance and more like breath. Inspector Sepha departed with his officers and the man who had sold children, promising to call by morning. The cameras, denied Scandal's cheap version, filmed something the city doesn't have words for yet. Yvonne faced Kendi in the small quiet that follows thunder. "I cannot buy back the years," she said. "I can spend the ones left differently." Kendi touched her anklet, then the edge of a chair, then the air between them. "We will see," she replied, which in the language of tide and truth means the door is not closed. And as the night exhaled, the house adjusted its weather again, not to spectacle, but to the slow work of mending what had broken under its own roof. Morning found the mansion softer than it had been in years. Lilies drooped into humility. Chairs sat back from the table like tired guests, and the band's last chord still seemed to be sleeping in the curtains. When Yvonne knocked gently on the staff cot room and asked Kendi, not ordered her, to come to the pier. They drove without the convoy, without gloss, carrying hom wine in a chipped bottle, because some ceremonies do not need crystal. And at the estuary edge, where mangroves stitched the water to land, Yvonne spoke Kojo's name aloud until it stopped catching in her throat. And Kendi, voice small but steady, spoke Abina's. Then they tipped the wine into brown water and watched it loosen into brightness, a quiet promise to the people who had held their lives together in their absence. Back at the house, Inspector Sepha called with the news justice makes. The network's accounts frozen, one suspect in custody, already singing the names of others, survivors relocated to a safe house with counselors and clean beds. "We'll take your statement next week," he said, "on your terms." And Yvonne, who had misused control for a decade, promised to lend it to the right places now. Lawyers for the girls, funding for the unit, audits for her foundation so money could no longer hide teeth. The estate began to molt. Contracts arrived with real wages and rest days, back pay cleared before lunch, a staff clinic set up in the West Wing with a nurse who knew how to treat burns and listen, a scholarship, the Abina Tide Fund, announced for daughters from the estuary who wanted school and a handrail. Mensa, unflappable in gatehouses and crises, became head of security and staff council chair. Auntie Binta's recipes migrated from memory to a binder that lived in the kitchen like a family tree. Rules changed in ways that seemed small but felt like light. No one ate standing. The TV in the common room was for everyone at a fixed hour. A box appeared by the time clock, labeled, "Say the hard thing," and people used it, sometimes trembling, sometimes laughing after. Kendi did not become soft overnight. Grief has aftershocks, and so does cruelty. She flinched at raised voices, startled at sudden footsteps, slept with her anklet in her palm like an anchor. But she also started learning accounting at the community center on Wednesday nights and practicing knife skills with Binta on Saturdays, laughing when an onion made everybody cry. She visited the estuary to repair the clinic roof and to sit by Abina's old doorway, telling the empty hut what had happened, leaving a little food on the step, because kindness is a ritual that should travel. The city tried to pry the story open with cameras, and Yvonne, for once, faced them without performance. "This house broke under my grief," she said, in a short statement outside the gate, Kendi beside her by choice and at her own distance. "We are mending it with work, not headlines. If you want a story, follow the girls being housed and healed. Pressure the courts to keep pace with the truth." And then she went back inside and put her name and money behind the things she had said. Weeks made room for habits to learn new grooves. On Fridays, staff ate jollof together under the jacaranda while someone told a story that didn't flatter the powerful. On Sundays, Yvonne and Kendi walked the hallway where the old portrait hung and stood deliberately, without speaking, before a new frame, an image shot in the courtyard. Cooks in aprons, gardeners with soil on their hands, Mensa half smiling, Binta proud and tired, and at the center, two women linked not by matching outfits or manufactured gloss, but by a shared grip on a braided cord. An anklet they'd strung together the night before, with sky-blue beads and one tiny nick on purpose, a visible reminder that perfection is not the goal of mending. Sometimes the past reached out with sharp fingers, Kendi waking to the smell of engine oil in dreams, Yvonne catching herself about to snap like a whip and closing her mouth as if it weighed as much as a door. But the house itself seemed to practice a different weather. Windows opened earlier, laughter traveled farther. The lullaby that once snuck up the stairs now drifted through the salon in daylight as Kendi taught it to Adzo, who taught it to the driver's twins, who came on visiting days and left sticky fingerprints that no one scolded off too fast. One evening, with the sky pulling orange into purple, Yvonne brought a small velvet box to the kitchen table and placed it on a folded napkin. "I cannot replace what I stole from you," she said, "but I can learn to give without taking." And when Kendi opened it, she found not diamonds, but a second anklet, made of the same sky-blue glass, the same purposeful nick, sized for a wrist. "So you never have to choose between walking and holding," Yvonne said, trying not to blink too much. Kendi slid it on, touched her ankle, touched her wrist, then reached across the table and finally touched her mother's hand. Abina used to say the sea remembers what the city forgets, she murmured. The words a bridge and not a wall. Then let's be the people who remember on purpose, Yvonne answered. And they sat there a little longer than necessary, while rice steamed and the house listened, slowly learning how to be a home.